It was 2:20 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon when Colonel Frank Garrison walked into the emergency room, blood seeping through his dress uniform. At 58 years old, his shoulders were squared and his combat ribbons caught the fluorescent light as he approached the triage nurse. "I need this looked at," he said gruffly. "Minor shrapnel. Just clean it and wrap it." The nurse, Lieutenant Torres, looked up from her station, her eyes scanning the wound, noticing how heavily he was bleeding. "Sir, you're bleeding pretty heavily," she said. "Let me get—" "I said minor," he snapped, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades in service. "Vintage grenade malfunction at the Marine Corps Museum. Embarrassing, but it's surface level. Just wrap it." Lieutenant Torres typed rapidly on her computer. "I'll page the on-call surgical resident." Naomi Cross, the on-call surgical resident, had been in the lounge for the past 4 hours, reviewing CT scans from her 3rd consecutive shift. She was moments away from finishing when the page came through. With 20 minutes left before her shift ended, she stood, pulled her dark hair back, and adjusted her scrubs. She reached for the door handle, her burn scar on her left forearm catching the light as she moved. Old habit. Naomi entered the room to find Colonel Garrison sitting on the exam table, blood soaked through a field dressing on his right shoulder. She approached him calmly. "Colonel Garrison, I'm de Cross. Let me take a look at that wound." He didn't meet her eyes. "Where's the real doctor?" he asked dismissively. Naomi's hands stilled for a moment. "I'm the surgical resident on call, sir. If you'll let me examine it, I asked for a doctor," he interrupted, eyeing her like she was an imposter. Naomi remained calm, unfazed. "I'm the one on call. I can help," he scoffed, his tone colder than any anger she had yet faced. "I've been in the field longer than you've been alive. I've seen what happens when people who aren't qualified try to play hero." Lieutenant Torres appeared in the doorway, confirming Naomi's position. "Sir, Dr. Cross is the surgeon on call, and she has the qualifications to handle this." "I've seen more combat wounds than most surgeons will see in their entire careers," Colonel Garrison said, his voice dropping to a low, icy tone. Naomi met his eyes, her voice steady. "And you also know that infection risk increases every minute we delay treatment." Something in her tone made him pause. His eyes searched hers for a moment before he exhaled sharply. "Fine, make it quick." Naomi went to work. She pulled on gloves, carefully peeled back the gauze, and examined the wound. As she did, her eyes narrowed. It didn't match the story he told. The entry wound was too clean for shrapnel, its edges slightly inverted. Something in the back of her mind stirred as she glanced at the blood pattern on his shirt. No exit wound, fragments still inside. Naomi stepped back, her mind racing. "Colonel, I need to order imaging," she said, her voice neutral but firm. "This wound requires a CT scan." "I said it's minor," he repeated, pulling away from her slightly. "Just clean it." Naomi felt the familiar tension rise in her chest. "Sir, the entry pattern suggests a bullet wound, not shrapnel. If there's a foreign body near the thoracic cavity—" She paused, watching his expression harden. "Are you questioning my assessment?" he growled, his anger bubbling up again. Naomi remained calm. "I'm questioning the mechanism of injury, sir, not your experience." Just as the tension between them reached its peak, Dr. Raymond Kellerman, the chief of trauma surgery, appeared in the doorway. His crisp white coat and surgical cap were still on from his previous case. He glanced between Naomi and Colonel Garrison. "What's the delay, Dr. Cross?" Naomi didn't look away from Colonel Garrison, her voice even. "Sir, I'm recommending immediate CT imaging. The wound characteristics suggest the colonel may have a retained foreign body near vital structures." Kellerman glanced at his watch. "It's a grenade malfunction, Dr. Cross. Shrapnel. Clean it, close it, discharge him with antibiotics." Naomi's hands clenched, but she didn't back down. "Dr. Kellerman, the entry wound characteristics don't match shrapnel. It's a bullet wound." Dr. Kellerman raised an eyebrow, his voice taking on an edge of impatience. "You're 6 weeks into residency. The colonel is a decorated Marine officer who's treated more combat injuries than most surgeons will see in their careers. I think we can trust his assessment." Naomi met his gaze calmly, her resolve hardening. "I'd still recommend imaging, sir." Kellerman's expression darkened, but he didn't argue further. Noted, proceed with wound cleaning and closure, standard protocol. He turned and left. Colonel Garrison smiled slightly, his arrogance returning. Naomi prepared the suture kit, her movements quick but efficient. She cleaned the wound, applied local anesthetic, and began suturing with interrupted stitches. Her hands moved with precision, her experience showing through in every motion. She worked quickly, a pattern emerging as her memory drifted back to places far from the sterile hospital room. Sergeant Marcus Wade, 2 beds over, watched the procedure through a gap in the curtain. His eyes narrowed. Naomi's technique wasn't normal. These weren't the usual neat stitches. These were military-grade field closures, the kind you learned when blood loss mattered more than cosmetic outcomes. Naomi finished the final stitch, applied a sterile dressing, and stepped back. "You're cleared for discharge, Colonel," she said, her voice calm. "Follow up in 5 days for suture removal. If you experience chest pain, shortness of breath, or anything unusual, I know the drill," he interrupted, standing and pulling his shirt back on carefully. "Maybe next time they'll send someone who actually knows what they're doing." He walked out. Lieutenant Torres stepped beside Naomi, shaking her head. "That was brutal." Naomi stripped off her gloves. "Request a standing order for a CT chest on Colonel Garrison." Torres hesitated. Dr. Kellerman already cleared him. Naomi didn't flinch. "Request it anyway. Note it in the chart as clinical concern for retained foreign body." Torres nodded slowly and left. Naomi walked toward the resident lounge, her mind racing. She could feel the familiar tension knotting in her stomach. Her shift was supposed to end hours ago, but something about this case wouldn't let her go. She grabbed her phone and set a reminder, check on CT order for Garrison. The burn scar on her left forearm caught the light as she typed. And for a moment, Naomi let herself breathe. Some wounds never fully heal, but some patterns once learned never fade. When she finally left the lounge at 7:15 p.m., she was more certain than ever. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Naomi Cross sat at her desk, reviewing the case studies on bullet fragment migration. Her mind kept returning to Colonel Garrison's wound, the one that had been dismissed as minor shrapnel when, in reality, it was something far worse. She rubbed her temples, the burn scar on her forearm catching the light once again. The articles she'd pulled up on her laptop only confirmed her suspicion. Bullet fragments, particularly those lodged near the spine, could migrate through tissue with even the slightest movement. She had requested a CT scan, but her attending had overruled her. The colonel had been cleared. Everything in her training screamed that she needed to be more insistent. But the system didn't work that way. She exhaled slowly. Her phone buzzed and her heart skipped a beat. A text from Lieutenant Torres. "CT got bumped. Radiology says tomorrow at the earliest." Naomi stared at the screen for a moment, weighing the options. She had no authority to recall a discharged patient. The colonel had been cleared, discharged, and released. But Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed something. That fragment could be closer to the heart now, deeper into his body with every passing minute. A simple decision that could prove to be fatal. She stared at the text, contemplating whether she should act. It was already 5 hours since the colonel had left. If the fragment had moved, it could be too late. She stood abruptly, grabbed her coat, and left the lounge. The hallway was quiet, but Naomi's mind raced. She had done everything she could within her power, but the feeling of doubt weighed heavily on her chest. She wasn't sure how much longer she could let the weight of these decisions sit on her shoulders. There were so many things that could go wrong, and so many things that already had. She passed through the hospital corridors, knowing that the colonel was likely sitting at home, unaware of the danger slowly creeping into his chest. At that moment, Sergeant Marcus Wade's voice echoed in her head. "You can't save everyone, but you can save the next one." She stopped in front of the nurse's station and pulled out her phone again. No new alerts, no updates, nothing. It was a waiting game now. At 9:15 p.m., after what felt like an eternity, Naomi was still sitting at her desk, waiting for something to happen. The waiting was the hardest part. Every hour that passed only made her more certain that she had made the right call, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. Her phone buzzed once more. Text from Torres. "Colonel Garrison returned. Trauma alert in progress." Naomi's stomach dropped. She grabbed her things, rushed toward Trauma Bay 2. Lieutenant Torres was already there, prepping for the worst. Naomi slipped into her trauma gown and gloves, positioning herself at the head of the bay. The doors burst open and paramedics wheeled in a gurney. Colonel Garrison lay unconscious, oxygen mask on, his face grey. His daughter Ellen walked alongside, holding his hand. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. This was the moment she had feared. She moved toward him, quickly assessing his vitals. His blood pressure was dropping, his heart rate was erratic. It was clear he was in shock. Naomi's eyes flicked between the monitors and the faint, labored breaths the colonel was taking. "What happened?" she asked, her voice steady, focused. Ellen's face was pale, her eyes wide with worry. "He said it happened when he reached up for something in the kitchen," she replied, her voice trembling. He felt something tear inside. Naomi's mind raced as she processed the information. The fragment had shifted, and now it was closer to the heart, closer to the pericardium. She looked down at the monitors. "We need to act fast," she said, her voice cutting through the air with quiet authority. Dr. Park rushed in, still wearing her surgical cap from an earlier case. Naomi quickly filled her in on the details. 58-year-old male, sudden onset of cardiac symptoms, history of shoulder injury 26 hours ago. Suspected retained bullet fragment. Park's eyes widened as the severity of the situation hit her. "The colonel, you wanted imaging for this?" Naomi nodded, her voice steady. "Yes, and now it's moved closer to the heart." Park looked at the monitors. "He's in shock," she muttered, glancing at Naomi. "Could be cardiac tamponade if the fragment punctured the pericardium." Naomi was already moving. "Lieutenant Torres, call cardiothoracic surgery. Tell them we need an operating room prepped for emergency pericardial window. Get me a portable ultrasound." Torres sprinted toward the phone. Naomi's hands were steady, but her mind was racing. She had been through situations like this before, but every time felt like the first. Every time felt like the last. "Colonel," she said, leaning closer to him, "I need you to stay still. This is going to hurt, but it will help you breathe." His eyes fluttered open slightly, and his voice was barely a whisper. "You were right," he murmured, his words heavy with fatigue. Naomi didn't respond. She just kept moving. The ultrasound cart arrived, and Naomi squeezed gel onto the probe. She positioned it over Garrison's chest, her eyes flicking to the screen. The image showed his heart and fluid surrounding it. Blood was filling the pericardial sac. Naomi inhaled sharply. It was worse than she had feared. She looked at Dr. Park. "We need to drain this now, or his heart's going to stop." Park glanced at the screen and made the call. "Pericardiocentesis here," she said, her voice firm. "We don't have time to wait for the OR." Naomi's voice was calm, resolute. "I've done it before." She positioned the needle. Her hands were steady as they had ever been. She inserted it at a 45-degree angle, advancing slowly as the tip appeared on ultrasound, moving closer to the pericardial sac. A subtle pop. Blood began to fill the syringe. Naomi exhaled as the monitors showed Garrison's blood pressure rising. His color began to return, ever so slightly. Naomi withdrew the needle, applied pressure to the site. "We've bought time," she said, her voice steady, but her mind was still racing. "But the fragment's still in there, and it's still bleeding. He needs surgery now." Torres was already on the phone. As they transferred him to the operating room, Naomi stayed close to his side. He was still unconscious, but the worst was over, for now. Ellen walked close behind, her grip tight on his hand. Naomi took a deep breath. This was what she had trained for, what she had fought for. This was what she had promised to do. She wasn't going to back down now. Not for anyone. The operating room was buzzing with activity as Colonel Garrison was transferred onto the table. Naomi stood at the edge of the sterile environment, her focus sharp as the cardiothoracic team prepped for surgery. She wasn't supposed to be here, not officially anyway, but this wasn't just another patient. This was the man who had dismissed her, who had looked past her expertise because of pride, and now he was back, fighting for his life. The team quickly took over, and Naomi stepped back, watching them work. Dr. Park, the lead surgeon, gave her a brief nod, acknowledging the tension in the room. Naomi stood still, her mind cycling through the events of the last 24 hours. The CT scan had shown a retained bullet fragment, just as she had suspected. a Russian-made 7.62mm bullet. Her instinct had been right. The danger hadn't been shrapnel. It had been much worse. It could have killed him, slowly and without warning. She had saved him, but at what cost? If she was wrong, if the fragment hadn't moved, the fallout would be catastrophic for her career. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but Naomi didn't reach for it. She wasn't ready to hear more bad news. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Park turned to Naomi, her expression grim. "We've got the fragment out. The damage wasn't as extensive as we feared, but he's going to need monitoring in ICU for at least 48 hours. No signs of tamponade, but the risk is still there." Naomi nodded, her body stiff with exhaustion. The worst had been avoided, but the emotional toll was starting to set in. As she left the operating room, she felt a deep ache in her chest, the weight of responsibility pressing on her. She had done what needed to be done, but she wasn't sure what would come next. She walked through the sterile halls of Walter Reed, trying to clear her mind. The hospital had felt like home for the past few years, but lately it felt suffocating. Naomi had built a life here, one that allowed her to forget the things she had seen in the field, the trauma that followed her every step. But now, as she passed by the nurses' station, she was reminded of what she had been trying to leave behind. The things she had witnessed during her tours in Afghanistan, the decisions she had been forced to make in the heat of battle. Those memories had a way of finding her again, especially in moments like this. She checked her phone as she reached the resident lounge, a text from Lieutenant Torres. "How's the colonel?" Naomi typed back. "Stable, ICU for monitoring." Then a second message appeared. "You've got a visitor, Sergeant Wade from yesterday. He's asking for you." Naomi felt a sudden tension in her shoulders. She hadn't expected him to come looking for her. Sergeant Wade was one of the soldiers who had been under her care during the battle at FOB Shir Gazai. She knew that he had been a witness to her work under fire, but she hadn't expected him to come to Walter Reed looking for her. Naomi took a deep breath and walked toward the orthopedic wing, where Sergeant Wade had been recovering from his leg injury. When she walked into the room, he was sitting up in bed, working through exercises with his healing leg. His eyes met hers immediately, sharp and alert. "Doctor," he said, his tone respectful but curious. "Sergeant," Naomi replied, walking toward his bedside. He motioned for her to sit. "I heard you saved a man's life today." Naomi hesitated, unsure where this conversation was going. "The colonel," he clarified. "I saw you in action. I don't think anyone else would have made the same call." Naomi sat, keeping her voice even. "It wasn't about making a call. It was about doing what I knew had to be done." Wade's eyes softened, and he leaned back against his pillows. "You don't get it, do you? What you did today wasn't just a decision. It was instinct. You saw something that others missed." Naomi didn't know how to respond. The weight of what he was saying hung in the air between them. She'd heard it before, back when she had saved soldiers during the siege at Shir Gazai. But the guilt still lingered. It always would. "You're not a first-year resident," Wade said quietly, his voice taking on a serious edge. "You're a trauma surgeon who's been through the worst of it. The things you've done, the lives you've saved, they don't go away just because you're in a different place now." Naomi met his eyes, her expression hardening. "That's not my life anymore, Sergeant. I left that behind." Wade didn't flinch. "You can't just leave that behind. It's who you are. It's why you're here, even if you're pretending otherwise." Naomi stood up slowly. "I don't need to explain myself to you." Wade's gaze was unwavering. "No, you don't. But you should think about what you're running from and whether it's worth it." Naomi didn't say anything. She turned to leave, but stopped when Wade called after her. "You're right, though," he said quietly. "You're not a first-year resident. You're so much more." Naomi paused for a moment before walking out of the room, her thoughts heavy with his words. She didn't know what she was running from anymore. But she did know one thing: she couldn't keep running forever. The following days blurred into one long stretch of hospital rounds, paperwork, and the steady rhythm of emergency care. Naomi Cross had spent her entire life running from the parts of herself that she feared the most: the trauma surgeon, the soldier, the woman who had seen too much and done too much. But as much as she tried to bury it, those parts of her never stayed buried for long. The conversation with Sergeant Wade had left a mark she couldn't ignore. He was right. She wasn't just a first-year resident. She had seen things, done things, that set her apart from the rest of the medical staff. And yet, she couldn't let herself embrace that reality. Not yet. The weight of her past was too heavy, the scars too deep. It was easier to pretend, to play the role she had been assigned here at Walter Reed, one of a resident with no experience in combat, no understanding of the complexities of military trauma. But the truth was, she had already saved more lives under fire than most surgeons would ever dream of saving, and that truth was slowly starting to claw its way back to the surface. Her shift had ended late, as usual, but Naomi didn't go home. Instead, she found herself in the hospital's research library, sifting through more case studies on trauma, bullet wound migration, and the long-term effects of combat injuries. Her mind was elsewhere, though. It always was. There was always the nagging thought of Colonel Garrison, lying in a hospital bed, recovering from the wound she had identified. The fragments of his injury were no longer a threat, but the consequences of her decision to intervene were still playing out. She had gone against Dr. Kellerman's orders, she had questioned his judgment, and now, despite saving Garrison's life, she wondered if she had made a career-ending mistake. Naomi closed her laptop, rubbed her eyes, and stood up. She needed a break from the endless cycle of second-guessing. As she walked through the quiet corridors of the hospital, the sounds of late-night staff and beeping machines filled the space around her. She wasn't sure where she was going, but she needed to be alone, to think. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't check it. Her mind was too clouded. Naomi found herself outside the trauma bay, standing in front of the windows that looked out over the busy emergency area. She was alone now, far from the place where decisions were made in an instant, where lives hung in the balance, where every choice could mean the difference between life and death. As she stood there, her phone buzzed again. This time, she pulled it out. The message was from Dr. Park. "You made the right call with Garrison. He's stable. Just wanted to let you know. Good work." Naomi stared at the text, her heart thudding in her chest. Good work. She hadn't heard those words in a long time. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She couldn't keep questioning herself. The world around her needed her skills, her judgment, her experience. She couldn't afford to waste any more time pretending she wasn't capable of making the tough calls. Naomi stood there, letting the weight of the message sink in. She had done her job. She had saved a life. And now the rest was up to her. She had to stop hiding, stop running from what she was capable of. The hospital, the military, and even the world outside were never going to make her feel like she belonged in this world of medicine if she couldn't first embrace who she truly was. The door to the trauma bay opened, and Lieutenant Torres appeared, her face tired but determined. "Dr. Cross, Dr. Kellerman is looking for you. It's about the Garrison case." Naomi nodded, her mind already focused on the next steps. She was done running. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to hide from it any longer. She followed Torres down the hall, her steps measured and confident. As they entered Dr. Kellerman's office, Naomi could already sense the tension in the air. Dr. Kellerman was sitting at his desk, his expression unreadable. When he saw Naomi, he didn't immediately speak. Instead, he gestured for her to sit. Naomi took the seat, her back straight, her mind sharp. Dr. Kellerman finally spoke. "Dr. Cross, I wanted to speak with you about your actions with Colonel Garrison, specifically about the imaging you requested after I cleared him." Naomi's heart sank. She had been expecting this moment, but she was ready. She met his gaze head-on. "I stand by my decision, Dr. Kellerman. The wound didn't match the mechanism he reported. I believed there was a retained foreign body, and I was right." Kellerman's jaw tightened, and for a moment Naomi feared he might reprimand her. But instead, he sat back in his chair. "You were right," he said quietly, "and I was wrong." Naomi blinked, surprised. "What?" Kellerman leaned forward, his eyes focused on her with an intensity that surprised her. "Your actions saved Garrison's life. I was too focused on protocol, too focused on the clearance from the attending. But in this case, protocol didn't matter. You made the right call, Cross." Naomi felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice steady. "And I want you to know, Dr. Cross, that you have my full respect," Kellerman added, his voice softer now. Naomi didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure what to say. She had earned his respect, but at what cost? She wasn't sure where this road would take her, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to stop moving forward. Not now, not ever. The following days brought an uneasy calm, a momentary reprieve from the storm that had been raging in Naomi's mind. Word about Colonel Garrison's recovery had spread through the hospital, and though her actions had been questioned by some, there was a quiet respect growing around her. No one was willing to openly admit that she had been right, not yet. But the way the doctors and residents looked at her now was different. She had made a choice, one that could have cost her everything, but it had saved a life. She wasn't sure if that was enough to absolve her of the lingering doubts about her future, but for now it was the only thing she had to hold on to. The hospital, as always, was a blur of activity. Naomi had shifted back into the rhythm of residency, rounds, paperwork, surgeries, but a part of her remained distant, always running the scenario through her mind, wondering if she could have done more or if the system would finally catch up with her. Every moment of success was quickly tempered with the fear of a mistake lurking just behind the next decision. It was a constant push and pull between doing what was right and doing what was expected. Naomi's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Dr. Park. "You're scheduled for an emergency case in Trauma Bay 2. Garrison's case is cleared, but we've got another one coming in. I'll be there in 10. Naomi glanced at the clock. It was just after lunch, and she hadn't expected to be called in again so soon. She stood up, grabbed her lab coat, and headed for the trauma bay. Her thoughts focused on the patient who would soon be wheeled through the doors. When she arrived, Dr. Park was already there, prepping for the incoming patient. Naomi quickly donned her gloves and surgical gown, her mind instantly shifting into the mode of precision that she had honed over the years. "What do we have?" she asked, her voice steady. "Multiple stab wounds," Dr. Park replied quickly, glancing at her chart. "A male, early 30s, signs of internal bleeding. We'll need to go in right away." Naomi nodded, moving with practiced efficiency toward the patient. A man in his early 30s who had been rushed in after a violent assault. His breathing was shallow, and his blood pressure was dangerously low. Naomi and Dr. Park worked quickly, preparing for the surgery ahead. As the team worked together, Naomi's mind briefly wandered. Despite the chaos surrounding her, the physical closeness of the work grounded her. She was used to the intensity of trauma surgery. It was familiar. In a way, it felt like home. Her gaze briefly flickered toward the corner of the room where a nurse was updating the charts. It was hard to remember a time when she hadn't been involved in cases like these. A time when she had been in a different role, doing less critical work. But she had learned. She had been tested, and each case, each patient, had shaped her in ways she never fully understood. When the surgery was over, the patient was stabilized, and Naomi allowed herself a small exhale. Dr. Park clapped her on the shoulder. "Good work, Dr. Cross. You handled that well." Naomi nodded, her mind already moving forward to the next task. As she left the trauma bay, she received another text, this one from Lieutenant Torres. "You've got a visitor, Dr. Cross. It's Sergeant Wade again." Naomi frowned. She hadn't expected him to come back so soon, but she couldn't ignore the pull he had on her thoughts. She walked to the orthopedic wing, finding Wade sitting up in bed, reading through a set of charts. His leg was healing well, but his eyes followed her every movement as she approached. "Dr. Cross," he greeted her, his voice calm but with a hint of something unspoken. "Sergeant," she replied, taking a seat next to his bed. He studied her for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began slowly. "About how you're trying to leave that part of yourself behind, the surgeon, the soldier. But you can't, can you?" Naomi met his eyes. His expression was serious, but there was no judgment in it, only understanding. "You know the things I've seen," she said quietly, "the things I've had to do." "Yeah," Wade said, "and you're not the only one. We all carry that weight, but you're not supposed to carry it alone. Not anymore." Naomi didn't respond immediately. His words stung in a way she hadn't expected. He was right. She couldn't keep running from the person she was. She had already buried so much of her past that there wasn't much left to hide anymore. But could she step into that truth without losing everything she had worked for? Could she embrace her identity as a trauma surgeon, someone capable of making life or death decisions, without becoming the person who had left her scars behind? "You don't have to carry the weight of your past, Naomi," Wade said, as if reading her thoughts. "You can learn to live with it. You just have to stop pretending it doesn't matter." His words were quiet, but they hit her harder than anything anyone had ever said. She had been pretending for so long, pretending she didn't belong here, pretending she was just another first-year resident, pretending the years of trauma and loss hadn't shaped her in ways that were irreversible. "You've done things that most people can't even imagine," Wade continued. "And you're still here. That's the part of you can't run from. And that's the part of you that makes a difference." Naomi stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. His words felt like a challenge, an invitation to stop hiding, to finally accept who she was. She stood up, her resolve hardening. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said, her voice steady. Wade didn't reply, but his gaze followed her as she left the room. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face it. Naomi's shift had ended hours ago, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Her mind kept replaying the conversation with Sergeant Wade, his words echoing in her ears. "Stop pretending." It was the kind of statement that cut through all the noise, the kind of statement that made her confront everything she had been avoiding. She had spent so long trying to leave behind the identity of the combat surgeon, trying to fit into this civilian world of medicine, but the reality was clear. She could never escape who she had been. Not entirely. The question now was whether she would accept it, whether she would embrace what she had learned, what she had survived, and what she could do with all that experience. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from Dr. Park. "You've got a consult, trauma alert, ETA 5 minutes. Naomi snapped out of her thoughts and stood up, pulling her lab coat over her shoulders. The hospital was never quiet, but tonight it felt even more alive with the hum of activity and the sharp clatter of footsteps echoing off the linoleum floors. When she arrived at the trauma bay, she found Dr. Park already preparing the area, her face focused. "What do we have?" Naomi asked, her mind already shifting back into the zone. 45-year-old male hit by a car," Dr. Park replied. "Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, he's unstable. We need to operate quickly." Naomi nodded, immediately assessing the situation. She could feel the adrenaline flooding her system, her body moving with a sense of urgency. It was exactly what she had trained for. She wasn't running anymore. This was who she was. This was what she did. As they worked on the patient, Naomi's thoughts became sharper, more focused. She wasn't thinking about the past, about the choices that had haunted her. She wasn't thinking about the uncertainty of the future. She was thinking about one thing: saving this man's life. The surgery was complicated, but Naomi's hands moved with the precision of someone who had performed life-saving procedures under fire. She had learned long ago that in moments like these, there was no room for hesitation, no time for doubt. Every decision had to be made quickly, but with certainty. There was no room for mistakes. When the surgery was finished and the patient was stable, Naomi exhaled, her body drained from the intensity of it all. She wiped her brow and looked up at Dr. Park. "Good work, Dr. Cross," Dr. Park said, her voice calm. Naomi nodded, but her mind was already moving to the next task. "Thanks. I'll update the chart." As she stepped out of the trauma bay, she received a message from Lieutenant Torres. "Dr. Cross, Dr. Kellerman wants to see you. He's in his office." Naomi's stomach tightened at the mention of Kellerman. She knew that meeting with him was inevitable. The tension between them had been brewing ever since she had questioned his judgment on the Garrison case. She couldn't avoid it forever. When she arrived at his office, Dr. Kellerman was sitting at his desk, reviewing charts, his expression unreadable. Naomi took a deep breath and knocked softly before entering. "Dr. Cross, sit," Kellerman said without looking up. Naomi hesitated before sitting across from him. "I've been reviewing your file, Cross," he began, his voice steady. "I know that you've been questioning your role here, whether or not you belong in this environment. And I know you've been struggling with your past, your military career, your trauma experience, but I need you to understand something." He finally looked up at her, his gaze piercing. What you've done here, your work in the trauma bay, your judgment, none of that was a mistake. You saved lives, Dr. Cross, and that's what matters. You made the right decision when others wouldn't have. And that's why you're here. Naomi swallowed, unsure of where this conversation was going. I'm not going to punish you for what you did, Kellerman continued. You went outside the lines. You challenged authority, but you did it to save a life. That's something I can't fault you for. Naomi sat in silence for a moment, her heart pounding. She had expected criticism, punishment, maybe even termination, but instead Kellerman was acknowledging her actions. He was offering her the respect she had been denied. I'm recommending you for early board certification, he said, breaking the silence. You've earned it. But I also want you to know that I'm not going to ask you to change. You have experience that no one here can match. You belong in this field, Naomi. You belong in trauma surgery. Naomi didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure what to say. She had spent so long doubting herself, doubting her place in this world, and now here was Dr. Kellerman offering her a position she had never imagined. She had been running from this for so long, but now she was being told it was okay to embrace it. It was okay to be the person she had always been. Thank you, Dr. Kellerman, she said quietly, her voice steady. I'll think about it. Kellerman nodded, his expression softening. Take your time, but know that this opportunity is yours if you want it. Just don't wait too long. Naomi stood up, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what her next step would be, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to run from it. She had made her choice. Now it was time to move forward. As she walked back down the hallway, her thoughts turned to the future. There were still so many decisions to be made, so many questions she didn't have answers to. But she was no longer afraid to face them. She had found her place again. The surgeon, the soldier, the woman who would no longer run from who she was. The following days were filled with a quiet confidence that Naomi hadn't known in years. The tension that had plagued her every moment at Walter Reed was starting to fade, replaced by something more grounded. Certainty. She was ready. For the first time since she had walked into this hospital, she wasn't pretending to be someone else. She wasn't hiding from her past. And, more importantly, she wasn't running from the person she had become. Word had spread about her involvement in Colonel Garrison's case, and though the respect from some of the attending staff was subtle, it was undeniable. Naomi had made a name for herself, and it wasn't one born from the system, but from her own choices, her own actions. But despite the quiet acknowledgement, Naomi remained focused on the work. The patients who needed her were the priority. Every decision she made from here on out was one that would be carried by her hands, her expertise, her experience. As the days went on, Naomi found herself settling into a rhythm, completing rounds, performing surgeries, and teaching the residents who had once viewed her with skepticism. The imposter syndrome she had felt so intensely began to lose its grip. One morning, just as her shift began, Lieutenant Torres found her in the hallway. She looked up as Naomi approached, and the expression on her face was unreadable. "Dr. Cross, you've got a consult," Torres said, handing her a chart. Naomi glanced down at the patient's details, an elderly woman with severe chest trauma, likely from a fall. It was a straightforward case, but there was something in Torres's tone that caught Naomi off guard. "Is something wrong?" she asked, glancing at the nurse. Torres hesitated for a moment before answering. "No, nothing's wrong. It's just, we've got a lot of high-priority cases coming in, and you've got a lot of eyes on you now. Some people think you should be taking on more." Naomi paused, absorbing the words. More? More complex cases, more leadership. People want to see what you can really do now that they know what you've done. Torres looked at her carefully. "This is your chance, Dr. Cross. People are noticing. It's up to you whether you take that step or not." Naomi stood still for a moment, considering the words. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of expectation. It wasn't just the hospital anymore. It was her own future. She could take the leap. She could push herself further, but was she ready? Was she ready to let go of the last fragments of her fear? The answer was already in her heart. She had already proven what she was capable of. And now it was time to do more than just survive. It was time to lead. Naomi looked up at Torres, her expression steady. "I'm ready," she said, the words quiet but firm. Let's go. The next few hours were a whirlwind. Naomi tackled case after case, her mind sharp, her focus absolute. She didn't have time for doubts. She was working with residents, leading the teams in ways she hadn't before, and the weight of responsibility was both overwhelming and exhilarating. The pressure wasn't new. She had carried pressure like this in combat. But here, in the sterile environment of the hospital, it felt different. The stakes were still life and death, but the battlefield was quieter, more controlled. By the end of the day, as Naomi walked out of the operating room, her body exhausted, her mind was buzzing with possibilities. This wasn't the path she had imagined when she first came to Walter Reed, but it was the one she had built. One decision at a time, one patient at a time. She was already thinking ahead, envisioning what her future could look like if she truly leaned into the experience she had gained. As she walked through the hospital halls, heading toward the resident lounge to grab her things, she spotted Park standing in front of the board with a chart in her hand. Naomi hesitated for a moment, then walked over. "You did well today," Dr. Park said, turning to face her with a nod. "Thanks," Naomi replied. There was something different in Dr. Park's tone now. Respect, acknowledgement, something that hadn't been there before. "You've earned your place here, Dr. Cross. Keep pushing. There's more ahead of you." Naomi met Dr. Park's eyes. She had never doubted herself as much as she had during those early days of residency, but today, standing in front of Dr. Park, she realized something. She wasn't just here by chance. She had earned this. Every decision, every moment of doubt, every victory. This was her journey. "I will," Naomi said quietly, and for the first time she felt completely sure of what she meant. That night, after her shift ended, Naomi sat in her apartment, alone with her thoughts. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Sergeant Wade. "Heard you took the lead today. That's the Naomi I remember." Naomi smiled softly, her heart warm despite the weight of the day. She had taken the lead. She was no longer waiting for someone to tell her it was her turn. It was her turn now, and she was ready for whatever came next. The following weeks felt like a turning point for Naomi. The hospital became both a battlefield and a place of growth, where every decision she made shaped not only her career, but the future of the residents she mentored. As much as she had run from her past, the reality was that it had made her who she was today. The trauma surgeon, the soldier, the woman who had been broken and rebuilt by the weight of loss and survival. Now, she stood in a position to lead, and though the thought was still daunting, she no longer felt like an imposter. The trauma bay was busy as usual, the steady hum of activity never stopping. Naomi had learned to navigate it like second nature, moving between cases with a sharp precision. She was ready for anything now, or so she thought. As she walked toward Trauma Bay 1, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from Dr. Kellerman. She opened it as she walked, the familiar surge of anxiety prickling at her skin. She had expected to be called into his office, but the email was different. It was a formal request to present her work at the upcoming medical conference in Washington. Dr. Kellerman had been impressed with her judgment on the Garrison case and wanted her to share her findings with a broader audience. Naomi stood still for a moment, her fingers gripping the phone. She hadn't anticipated this level of recognition. She had saved Garrison's life, yes, but she had done it because it was the right thing to do. She hadn't expected accolades, but here they were. As the day wore on, Naomi found herself wrestling with the offer. She had spent so much time avoiding the spotlight, refusing to acknowledge her own capabilities, that the idea of standing before an audience, presenting her work, felt almost foreign. But something inside her shifted. She had earned this, not just the recognition, but the right to take pride in what she had accomplished. That night, she sat down at her desk, her laptop open in front of her. She typed out a draft of the presentation, outlining the Garrison case, the risks of undetected foreign bodies in combat wounds, and the importance of following one's instincts when the system fails. It wasn't just about the surgery, it was about the larger message. Trust your judgment. Trust your training. Naomi finished the draft, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel proud. The next morning, she received a message from Dr. Park asking if she could come by her office. Naomi felt a moment of unease. She had been keeping her distance from the attending staff, trying to focus on the work, but Park had been a steady presence in her residency. She walked down the familiar hallways to Dr. Park's office, unsure of what to expect. When she entered, Dr. Park was sitting behind her desk, her expression serious but not unkind. "Dr. Cross," she said, looking up at Naomi, "I've been following your work these past few weeks. You've been pushing boundaries, taking on complex cases, and your leadership has been impressive." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. "Thank you, Dr. Park," she replied, her voice steady. "But I wanted to talk to you about something," Dr. Park continued. Naomi paused, uncertain. "Go ahead." Dr. Park set the papers in front of her and leaned forward slightly. "You've been handling these cases like someone who's already been in this field for years, someone who's been through it all. I've noticed how you mentor the residents, how you take charge when things get tough." Naomi felt a knot form in her stomach. "I'm just doing my job," she said, keeping her voice calm. "You're doing more than that," Dr. Park replied, her voice soft but firm. "You're stepping into a leadership role. You've already proven you have the skills, the experience, and the drive. But you're also holding yourself back. I think it's time you stopped running from who you are." Naomi stared at Dr. Park for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. For years she had tried to hide, tried to blend into the background, to be something she wasn't. But maybe it was time to stop pretending. "You've got a future here, Naomi," Dr. Park said, her tone gentle. "A future as a leader, a teacher, and a surgeon who knows how to make the impossible decision in a heartbeat. You don't need to wait for permission to claim that future. It's yours." Naomi felt the words wash over her like a slow tide, grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about the work anymore. It was about the person she was becoming. She wasn't just a first-year resident. She wasn't just a soldier. She was Naomi Cross, and she had earned every part of who she was. "Thank you, Dr. Park," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I think I've been running for too long." Dr. Park smiled. "It's time to stop running then. It's time to lead." Naomi stood up, her mind made up. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer afraid of it. As she walked out of Dr. Park's office, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had come a long way from the young, unsure surgeon who had first entered Walter Reed. And now, for the first time, she was ready to step into the future that had always been hers for the taking. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was ready to face whatever came next. She had stopped running, and now she would lead. The days that followed were a blur of activity, but this time Naomi embraced the pace. She had found her stride, not just as a surgeon, but as a leader in her field. She had stopped questioning whether she belonged here, and instead focused on proving that she did. The respect from her colleagues had grown, but it was the relationships she had built with her residents that filled her with pride. Naomi had never imagined herself in the role of a mentor, but here she was, guiding a new generation of trauma surgeons, passing on what she had learned from years of experience in combat. The hospital had become a place of both healing and growth for her. Each case was a reminder of why she had chosen this path. The days were long, the work grueling, but there was a satisfaction that came with it now. Something she hadn't felt before. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. One afternoon, Naomi found herself in the break room, sipping coffee and catching up on the latest updates. Lieutenant Torres entered with a serious expression on her face. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" "There's a meeting in Dr. Kellerman's office," Torres said, glancing around before lowering her voice. "He's asked for you to attend." Naomi felt a stir of apprehension. She hadn't been in Dr. Kellerman's office since the conversation about Colonel Garrison. She had hoped that chapter was closed, but something told her this wasn't over. "I'll be right there," Naomi replied, standing up and grabbing her things. As she entered Dr. Kellerman's office, she was surprised to see not just him, but Dr. Vance and a few other administrators seated around the table. Dr. Kellerman looked up from his papers and motioned for Naomi to sit. "Dr. Cross," he began, his voice professional but with an edge of formality, "we've been reviewing your progress and the work you've done here at Walter Reed. You've been an exemplary resident, and your contributions have been invaluable to this institution." Naomi nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure where this conversation was headed, but she was ready to listen. "However," Dr. Kellerman continued, "it's clear that you're outgrowing the role of a first-year resident. Your experience, your leadership, and your ability to handle high-stakes trauma cases have not gone unnoticed. Naomi remained silent, unsure of where this was leading. The truth is, Dr. Cross, Dr. Vance spoke up. We've been considering a change in your position here. We think you're ready for a more advanced role, one that recognizes your expertise and the level of care you bring to your patients. Naomi's pulse quickened. She had expected a review of her work, but this was something entirely different. She had been here less than a year. How could they already be considering this? Dr. Kellerman leaned forward, locking eyes with Naomi. We're offering you the position of trauma surgery attending. You'll be overseeing some of our most critical cases, leading the team in trauma surgeries, and mentoring the residents. This would be a formal promotion, and we believe it's the right step for you. Naomi sat back in her chair, stunned. This was more than she had ever imagined. A promotion to attending. She had barely begun to get comfortable in her role as a resident, and now they were offering her this. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, but there was a quiet part of her that knew what the answer had to be. She had come so far. She had earned this. I'm honored, Naomi said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts in her head. But I have to admit, I wasn't expecting this so soon. Dr. Vance smiled slightly. We weren't expecting it either, but your performance here has exceeded all expectations. We need someone like you in this role, someone who has the experience to handle these cases and the leadership to guide others. Naomi took a deep breath. This was her moment. This was the future she had worked for. I accept, she said quietly, her voice firm. Dr. Kellerman's expression softened. I'm glad to hear that, Dr. Cross. You've earned it. We're excited to see you take on this new role. Naomi left the meeting with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just a surgeon anymore. She was a leader. And as she walked back to her office, she realized that everything she had gone through, the challenges, the doubts, the trauma, had led her to this moment. It had made her who she was today. She wasn't running from her past anymore. She had embraced it, and now she was ready to shape the future. That evening, as she sat in her office reviewing her cases, her phone buzzed once more. It was a text from Sergeant Wade. Heard the news. Congratulations, Doc. I knew you had it in you. Naomi smiled softly, her heart warmed by his words. She typed back, Thanks, Sergeant. I couldn't have done it without the lessons I learned along the way. She set her phone down and looked out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. This was her new beginning. She was ready for whatever came next. Naomi stood at the podium, the weight of the moment settling over her like a quiet storm. The room was filled with doctors, surgeons, and administrators, all of them looking to her for guidance, for leadership. It had been months since she had accepted the role of trauma surgery attending, and now, here she was, leading the department through its most critical challenges. She had come a long way from the unsure resident who had once questioned her place in this world. The journey had been anything but easy. But standing here, with her team gathered around her, Naomi felt a sense of purpose she had never felt before. She wasn't just doing this for herself anymore. She was doing it for the patients who depended on her, for the residents she mentored, and for the community that had taken her in when she had nowhere else to turn. As the lecture began, Naomi's voice echoed in the large conference room. Trauma surgery is about more than just repairing wounds. It's about understanding the body's ability to heal, the mind's capacity to endure, and the heart's refusal to give up, even when all seems lost. Her words were calm, measured, but there was an intensity in her eyes that conveyed everything she had experienced. The battles fought, the lives saved, the lives lost. She had seen it all. And now she was passing it on to the next generation of surgeons. She moved through the room with ease, guiding her residents through a series of complex cases, offering insight and feedback, pushing them to reach their potential. It was exactly what she had once needed, someone to believe in her, someone to show her what she was capable of. And now she was that person for others. The days that followed were filled with a sense of fulfillment Naomi hadn't known in years. She had stepped fully into her role as a leader, and with every surgery, every decision, she was reshaping the future of trauma surgery at Walter Reed. But with each success, the weight of responsibility grew heavier. She wasn't just teaching medical techniques, she was teaching her residents how to handle the emotional toll of the work, how to face the inevitable losses without losing themselves. One afternoon, as Naomi reviewed a patient's chart in her office, her phone buzzed with a text from Ellen Garrison. She smiled as she read the message. "Dad wanted me to let you know that he's doing great. He's back to his old self. Thank you, Dr. Cross. You gave us more time together." Naomi felt a tightness in her chest as she reread the message. It had been a long time since she had heard those words, since she had saved someone's life in a way that truly mattered. She had been so focused on the next case, the next challenge, that she hadn't taken a moment to reflect on the lives she had touched. She set the phone down and looked out the window, the weight of the last few years finally settling in. She had given up so much to be here, to become the surgeon she was. But she had also gained more than she ever imagined. She had found her place in the world. She had found her purpose. Later that evening, as she walked through the hospital halls, she passed by the trauma bay, the heart of Walter Reed's emergency care. She paused for a moment, her thoughts drifting back to the early days of her residency. It had been here, in these very halls, that she had questioned herself the most, unsure if she truly belonged. But now, as she stood there, Naomi knew that this was where she was meant to be. Her journey had come full circle. She had stepped into her role as a leader, not because of the title, but because of the trust that had been placed in her. She had earned this. She had earned every step of the way. Naomi's phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was another text, this time from Dr. Park. "The fellows are ready for their next session. Are you ready to lead?" Naomi smiled. She was more than ready. As she made her way to the lecture hall, she passed by a group of residents who greeted her with respectful nods. They didn't just see her as the attending anymore. They saw her as the mentor, the leader who had guided them through their own challenges. They saw her for who she truly was. The woman who had found her place in a world that was constantly shifting. The woman who had stopped running. The woman who had stepped into the future, knowing that the weight of her past would never disappear, but that it no longer defined her. When Naomi walked into the lecture hall, she didn't just take her place at the front of the room. She owned it. This was her space now. This was her future. And as the next generation of surgeons filed in, ready to learn from her, Naomi realized that she had already shaped the legacy she had always dreamed of. It wasn't about the accolades or the recognition. It was about the lives she had touched, the lessons she had imparted, and the way she had finally found peace with who she was. She had done it. She had built something new from the ashes of her past, and for the first time, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "All right," Naomi said, her voice steady, "let's get started." As the room filled with the sounds of eager minds ready to learn, Naomi Cross smiled. She was ready for whatever came next, but she was also ready to stay right where she was.